two monster hurricanes, back to back. During a 13-day stretch, Hurricanes Helene and Milton packed a 1-2 punch the likes of which Tampa Bay had never seen. Soon after Milton made landfall, a construction crane crashed into a downtown building. Our building. Our home. That would not stop the Tampa Bay Times. In the first 24 hours after Milton's arrival, reporters filed a new story every 8 minutes, tracked the wreckage, chronicled heroic rescues, and provided vital information to help the community cope with our shared trauma. The storms were just the beginning. The road to recovery will be long, and the Tampa Bay Times will be there for our readers every step of the way.
Good evening. Welcome to Spotlight Tampa Bay. Thank you for joining us tonight for Beyond the Storm, Strengthening Tampa Bay's Resilience, presented by Tampa Electric. My name is Conan Gallaty. I'm the CEO and chairman of the Tampa Bay Times, and it's truly an honor to have you here with us at this event where we're going to keep the community informed. This commitment becomes even more critical in important situations like times of crisis, the times of hurricanes, when access to reliable information can make all the difference. Like many of you in this room, the Times, as you saw in that video, has weathered incredible challenges in the aftermath of Hurricanes Helene and Milton. But it's through collaboration and resilience and determination that we move forward together. Tonight's discussion convenes experts, civic leaders, and community members to explore the vital strategies and insights for strengthening our region's resilience. What makes these conversations truly special is they're brought to you by the Times' Pulitzer Prize-winning newsroom. By being here tonight, you are going to be experiencing live, meaningful, and community-driven journalism in action. And we are now all deputizing you as journalists yourselves. We hope you will ask insightful questions, so please participate in the process. We're fortunate to have with us an exceptional panel who we'll introduce here shortly, but first, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Tampa Electric for their generous support in making this evening and the broader Spotlight Tampa Bay Sustainability Series a reality. Let's hear a little more from Tampa Electric about how they stay prepared for the storms ahead.
Tampa Electric, we spend all year getting prepared for storm season.
We work as hard as we can, both before storm season and during storm season.
Always, always, always. It's our priority for our customers.
My name is Jerry Chesay, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Tampa Electric.
My name is Irma Lawrence, and I work in system service.
My name is Philip Reynolds, Director of Distribution, Engineering, and Operations for Tampa Electric Company.
It's so important to plan for the storm because you never know what can happen.
So we're hardening our transmission lines.
Trimming trees throughout the year.
We're undergrounding lines 80 to 100 miles a year.
We get the team together and we talk about, okay, all the possibilities.
Everyone in the company has a storm role specific to helping us restore power as quickly and safely as possible. Once a storm hits, it's all hands on deck.
We employ damage assessors immediately as soon as the winds drop below 40 miles an hour.
Utility workers at Tampa Electric are on 24 hours a day.
We start receiving mutual assistant crews from all over the country.
We try to restore as many customers as fast as possible.
It's not over until the last customer's back on.
As a lifelong Florida resident who's lived through several hurricane events, 2004, 2017.
We have friends and neighbors in the community, and we're right there with you.
We take pride in getting our customers restored as quickly and safely as possible.
What I'd like to say to all our customers out there,
don't be scared, be prepared.
Don't be scared, be prepared.
Don't be scared, be prepared.
It's now my privilege to introduce someone who's played a key role in supporting the shared vision for a stronger, more sustainable Tampa Bay. Karen Sparkman serves as Vice President of Customer Experience for both Tampa Electric and Peoples Gas. Since joining TECO in June of 2017 as Director of Customer Experience and Operations, Karen has been instrumental in transforming how the companies support and engage with customers, from modernizing billing and payments to advanced technology and improving contact center operations. Her leadership has propelled Tampa Electric in the top 25% of all U.S. electric utilities in J.D. Power's utility ranking, while Peoples Gas continues to rank among the very top gas companies in the nation. Karen's team will tell you that she leads with her heart, and her compassion inspires them to make a positive impact for every customer. Please join me in welcoming Karen Sparkman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an important conversation with a panel of leaders on the forefront of Tampa Bay's resilience against severe weather. Resilience in the face of all storms is vitally important to us at Tampa Electric, and we know that it's paramount to the community we serve. So we're pleased to bring this conversation to you all tonight. I think most of us would agree that we are very fortunate to live in a society where electricity gives us our daily comforts, conveniences, and even a lifeline. From powering our homes to public safety and first responder facilities to hospitals providing life-saving medical care, electricity is essential to our modern lives. So for TECO, our ability to withstand threats and bounce back quickly is critical. It's a key part of who we are as a company, and we think about it every single day. Our mission and continuous challenge as an electricity utility is to deliver power that is reliable, there when you need it, and always on. Electricity that is sustainable, and to deliver that electricity affordably. That is not an easy balance to strike, and we work hard at it. Reliability comes from strengthening and modernizing our grid, which is an ongoing effort that enabled TECO to recover as fast as we did from the most significant hurricane our region has faced in over a century. Sustainability involves making our power plants more efficient, reducing our emissions, and balancing the fuels we use to generate electricity, including natural gas and a large and growing amount of solar. These efforts, though, of course, do come at a cost, and being strong and sustainable in a way that is also feasible and affordable takes careful consideration and planning. Tonight's conversation is so timely. We've been through a lot together this year as a region, but we know that in times of crisis, while difficult, present opportunities for growth and improvement. And engaging with diverse perspectives can be incredibly valuable in guiding quality solutions for a bright future. So Tampa Electric is honored to help bring this conversation forward, and we thank you all for being here to take a part in it. Thank you.
So before we get started, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists. We'll start with Carlos here at the end. If you can tell us your name, your title, where you're from.
Sure. So I'm Carlos Odazabal. I'm the Vice President of Energy Supply for Tampa Electric Company. I was born and raised here in Tampa, so I spent my entire career in the Bay Area.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon Arroyo, Vice President of Government and Community Relations for Duke Energy. And I also have spent my entire career with Duke Energy, so lifelong utility worker.
Hi, I'm Kara Woods-Sarah. I'm with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, and I serve as the Director of Resiliency. I've been in Tampa Bay for about 20 years, and I'm a graduate of USF.
I'm Maya Burke. I'm the Assistant Director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, and I'm Pinellas County born and bred.
My name is Josh Bellotti, Engineering and Operations Director for Hillsborough County Public Works. I'm also a native of the Tampa Bay area. I've worked at Hillsborough County for 12 years.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. So in this first question, I'd love to have you take it away, Carlos. You know, we faced an unprecedented hurricane season, as you've seen in the videos we shared earlier in this session, with a double whammy in Tampa Bay from both Helene and Milton. causing storm damage we haven't seen in a century. I'm wondering, Carlos, if you could tell us and share some of the lessons you've learned at Tampa Electric from this storm season.
Sure, happy to do so. First of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you for joining us tonight. So as Justine said, you know, this was an unprecedented hurricane season in 2024. We had essentially a 1-2 punch. First from Hurricane Helene, who brought record storm surge to the Tampa Bay area and St. Pete, obviously. And then literally within 2 weeks, we had Hurricane Milton, which was the strongest hurricane to impact West Central Florida in over 100 years. Every storm brings different lessons learned. If I had to pick 2 lessons learned from these 2 storms, one with Hurricane Helene, with the storm surge that we experienced, we realized even though we have flood walls at our generation stations, we experienced significant flooding at a lot of our different substations in a lot of different areas that we weren't anticipating to experience the kind of flooding we experienced. Then when you layer on the fact that the ground was saturated 2 weeks later with Hurricane Milton coming in and having 100-mile-per-hour winds, we saw a significant amount of tree damage to our system. So the 2 lessons learned I would recommend for us would be to elevate some of the infrastructure we have. Even though we have flood walls around our generation stations, there's a lot of other ancillary equipment that perhaps needs to be raised for these types of storm surges that we may be having with these types of storms. And the second is about 85 to 90% of the damage that we saw from Milton was as a result of downed trees or branches in power lines. So along our transmission corridors, one of the things that we're going to be looking at is the clearance around those transmission corridors with the trees. Is that sufficient? Do we need to expand that clearance, trim those trees back more so a lot of the transmission damage that we experience doesn't happen again? So we're looking at that along with numerous other lessons learned that we typically implement after every storm that hits the service area of Tampa Electric.
Sharon, would you like to chime in from the Duke perspective?
Sure, thank you. And like Carlos mentioned, or I think actually it was on your video, that every utility employee worker has a storm role. And so many of us are thinking about storms and how we prepare for them all year long, even in our blue sky job. And lessons learned is a huge part of that. After Helene and Milton, we have 821 lessons learned that we will work till June 1st when next season starts to implement and correct. But I would say that one of the most important lessons we learned from Irma, and that we have employed since, and that made an impact for us in these storms, was where we bring in our contractors and stage them. So if you think back to Irma, which we don't like to do, because Irma was a very significant storm, but if you think back to Irma, it came up through the north part of the state and went straight up the north, which was not expected. It was a last-minute change, as hurricanes are often do. And we had staged our crews in Georgia. So it took a few more days before we could even get them to a job site. So we pivoted our whole plan, and now we will bring in contractors early and stage them closer to the work where we anticipate the work to be. And that's made a huge difference for us. We've employed staging sites that are near the work, but getting those crews to the site, to the damage, as quickly as possible made a huge difference for us in the amount of days it took for us to restore. And for Helene, we restored all that could receive power within 3 days, and for Milton, all that could receive power within 4 days of the storm landfall. So that really has been a game changer for us, is where we put our crews. But I would say the second thing is the relationships that we build, and I know TECO is the same way, with our emergency preparedness, our emergency operating centers, with our counties, with our fire chiefs, et cetera, make a huge difference and are employed during any storm. This was, as many have mentioned, a significant storm surge event, both of those storms. And we actually, in the midst of the storm, partnered with the EOC in Pinellas County and the fire chiefs and had our crews going out with the fire chiefs when you get the homes that are flooded and it's impacting when you turn the power back on. We had the fire chiefs with them. So that was a huge lesson learned and something that we'll continue to do going forward.
Thanks for sharing those stats, too. Carlos, do you have any from Tampa Electric in terms of how quickly you were able to restore power?
Sure. With Helene, the restoration was 1 day, which was pretty impressive. With Milton, it took a little bit longer. It took 7 days for us to restore power to our customers. Again, with those that could have their power restored. I know it's extremely frustrating. People wonder, why is it taking so long? But again, we brought in 6,000 resources and stood up 8 incident bases as a result of Hurricane Milton. That's unprecedented. We've never stood up more than 3 or 4 incident bases in prior storms. So having 6,000 resources on our systems, as you can imagine, it's a logistical challenge. And we got to make sure safety is our #1 priority. When you start having too many resources on the system, it can be challenging to ensure that we don't energize something where crews are still working on the line. So it's a very difficult and coordinated effort, not only internally, but with our neighboring utilities, with Duke and FPL, because a lot of the transmission infrastructure that was damaged, it's interconnected transmission lines. And again, those transmission lines are the ones that you see on the side of the highway, the taller towers, not the distribution lines. Those transmission lines were damaged significantly as a result of Milton.
I would just add one more thing, Justine, that you triggered me in thinking about, Carlos, was the significant damage that you're talking about was unprecedented, as we've said, and the tree damage and some of those areas. One of the things that we quickly changed course in the middle of the storm, and I know in talking with Archie, Tampa Electric did the same, is how we tell the story. And I know we've got some of our corporate here with us tonight who actually was out taking intense pictures of where the damage was and how bad. I mean, some of the tree damage was so extensive, and people don't understand and are wondering why it is taking us 1, 2, or 3 days. So getting that message out and just flooding the social media with what our crews were experiencing when they were trying to restore power really did help us in telling the story.
You know, a piece of Helene and Milton that we experienced here in Tampa Bay that seemed to just overwhelm so many communities was the flooding, both in our coastal areas but also inland. And I think a lot of those inland communities experienced flooding that they weren't prepared for and were surprised by. And Josh, I was wondering if you could take that on, talk about what led to some of that record flooding that we saw, and also what are kind of discussions our local government's having to mitigate that for future storms.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss that. You know, these storms and this season brought just devastating impacts to our community, and it's been really difficult times for everybody to deal with, and I know you know all of us are connected to it in some way. Everybody on the stage or in this room has friends or family that have dealt with flooding, and you know it's people that have lost everything. So I want to talk a little bit about the flooding by kind of going back to set the stage. You know, we talked about the 1-2 punch of Helene and Milton, but really it was like a series of punches. I mean, going all the way back to Hurricane Debbie, if anybody remembers Hurricane Debbie, we don't talk a lot about it anymore, and it wasn't really significant impacts in our area because we had a lot of storage in our system at the time. But what it did was start to saturate the ground, raise the levels of our lakes and rivers and streams throughout the county. Then we had a record-breaking August. August had a record level of rainfall, exceeding a previous record that was set in 1949. So then on the heels of that, you have Hurricane Helene come in. And so we had the like Carlos said, the record storm surge and thousands of homes along our coastline that were impacted and devastated by the storm surge of Helene. And then 2 weeks later, here comes Milton with the record levels of rainfall. And this rainfall, 200 to 500 year event level of rainfall across the entire county, but not just across the entire Hillsborough County, but all of the Central Florida region. So, you know, the volume of that rain is what was so significant as well in terms of, you know, the areas of flooding that took a long time to recede. So, you know, the volume of rainfall that occurred within Hillsborough County was over 155 billion gallons. Now, what does that mean? So picture an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now picture 250,000 of those. Well, that may be difficult to do as well. But if you spread all those out, it would cover the city of Orlando with Olympic-sized swimming pools. So it was just a huge volume of water that was dropped in these areas. And You know, I think another eye-opening thing that we've all kind of learned from Milton is how connected all of these waterways and systems are within the county. So, you know, talk about the inland flooding, people that weren't expecting it. I don't live anywhere near to a river or a creek, but we've got drainage basins at the county, which a drainage basin is basically like a big bowl. But these are hundreds of square miles, and they all drain to the same place. And so if all of that water is going into the same place, let's say the Hillsborough River, which is staged up to record levels, it had nowhere to go. And so that was the unfortunate situation where we saw a lot of flooding in inland areas, and it stayed there for a long time because of just the sheer volume of it.
You know, the thing is, you have to really, hurricanes pose these different variety of risks, and it challenges like us all as individuals, is our ability to perceive and assess that risk and act appropriately. So we almost got set up for a sort of false way of thinking about what risks were happening based on our experience with Helene, which was basically storm surge flooding. So if you lived on the coast, it was a coastal event. Those properties were vulnerable. People were underestimating the risks associated with freshwater flooding and rainfall flooding and wind and all of these different things. So I had just tons of conversations with friends and neighbors and community folks, just sort of helping them talk through and thinking about what risks they were actually vulnerable to in their very individualized circumstances. And I think that's hard. I think we're not good as individuals at assessing that risk and sort of thinking about these things in a systemic kind of way. And so that's I think a really challenging thing. And I've worked in water resource management for more than 20 years now. And the number of times I hear people confuse things like an evacuation zone, which is related to coastal surge flooding, with a flood zone, which could be coastal surge flooding, or it could be coastal surge and freshwater rainfall flooding, or it could be based on living near a river or a wetland. The truth is, y'all, we live in Florida. It's low-lying. Every single one of us lives in a floodplain. It's a matter of how much risk you have. And that risk profile is really changing because our baseline is shifting. And that's something that's really hard to wrap your mind around if you're a scientist or an engineer, and it's even harder if you're a regular person focused on, whatever it is, your day-to-day, taking care of your family, taking care of your home. That's a challenge that we have to work through as a region, how we manage our individual risk and what we expect out of our public institutions to help protect us from those risks.
So Josh, to follow up, I'm sure you and your colleagues at the county are discussing this and talking about those basin bowls where the water fills up. I mean, what is the next step, knowing that those are going to fill in storms, that we have to come up with a new solution?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Hillsborough County Commission approved and directed was a independent study. So this is truly a multi-agency regional study, so involving partners at the 3 cities within Hillsborough County, or the surrounding counties, because the water doesn't know any borders of county governments, as well as the water management districts and our private partners and the community as well. And so the purpose of this is to look at, take a deeper dive into the effects of what occurred during Milton and try to identify some things that may be able to help mitigate those in the future. So, I mean, one of the things is, our stormwater infrastructure, all of our built infrastructure is designed to a 25-year level event, which those are the events that occur more frequently. But, when you have an event like Milton that far exceeds that, none of the infrastructure is built to withstand that. So it's a measure of risk, and it's a measure of, what's the expectation of us collectively as a community? What do we want to plan for? And I think there's some really significant and impactful kind of aspects to consider with that. There's certainly capital investment, but then there's also, regulatory type of things to be considered as well. So, I mean, we're looking forward to what the study is going to bring and the discussion that that's going to bring, but we're recognizing that it's going to be some really tough discussions about what to do going forward.
And I wasn't here in 1960, but some of you were. And so Florida experienced Hurricane Donna, and we learned with Hurricane Donna, when people flooded, that we should create these flood control structures, and it's a really big part of the founding of our water management districts and the way we manage our water resources as a state. And so what we have done is invested in altering the landscape dramatically. We've created flood control structures, we've ditched and drained much of the landscape, and we are now playing God. We are controlling water with weirs, with pipes, with pumps. And these are all things that can be really excellent because they can help reduce our risk for flooding. But we have to understand that these changes to the hydrology also are vulnerable if we don't continue to invest in maintaining them, and they can also pose really important challenges to our water quality. Many of you might hear us talk about the Everglades, and they talk about restoring the flow and what goes on in Lake Okeechobee. But that story isn't just true for the Everglades, it's true here in Tampa Bay too. We have areas where we see poor water quality in Tampa Bay because we are not allowing water to move slowly over the landscape for plants to pick up those pollutants as the water moves over the landscape. And so we're at a real risk. If we don't look back and learn from our history in the 1960s and what our response was, I understand. It's terrible to have your home flooded. I personally have very close friends and family that are going through all of this, and that smell is burned in my nostrils of what it's like to handle these kinds of things. So I'm not immune to the public pressure or desire for better flood control management, but I beg us as a region not to just shunt it out and pipe it and pump it to the bay as fast as possible, because we're going to pay for it, and we're going to pay for it in the things that we love, the way we have fun, the way we feed our families, the way we find peace, the things that we really enjoy about this place. So we have to sort of learn some lessons and make sure that we're doing things like natural channel design and working with green infrastructure, that these solutions are not just the kinds of technological band-aids that we put on it 50 years ago, but instead we're doing a 21st century kind of approach to stormwater management where it's not just flooding, but it's flooding and water quality.
All right. So moving on from flooding, we mentioned that what made these storms unique too was the amount of saturated ground that we had just after a busy tropics season, late in the season, which also led to a bunch of trees down. It affected our power lines, it affected people's homes, obviously, but it also affected our urban tree canopy. We've written about that in the Tampa Bay Times. Kara, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that tree loss means for our community, both in the short and long term, and what should we be thinking of in the future in terms of, should we be planting different types of trees?
Sure. So the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council is currently hosting a tree management group that's trying to think about some of these issues, and we obviously need to be working with our partners at the electric companies, because we know that the electric infrastructure can be impacted by trees and tree fall, but we also know that we need those trees for a lot of the heat mitigation impacts that we're trying to mitigate. And the city of Tampa recently released a climate equity plan that really encourages additional tree planting, and we know that that's a important way for us to start to look at that really important issue of heat, but also it's something that can allow us to reduce or mitigate some of our greenhouse gas emissions. It provides a lot of benefits. It's also a flood mitigation benefit as well. So we know that the trees are something that we need to really prioritize, but kind of balancing that with some of the damage that we saw after Milton is definitely a challenge. I think you mentioned the right trees in the right places. I think I read one study that showed that a lot of the trees damaged in a previous storm were non-native trees. And then thinking again about the amount of trees, we've started to hear research around trees in threes, so planting not just one single tree that might get more easily blown over by wind, but a set of 3 trees, thinking about how we integrate trees into our development regulations, and where those kind of intersect with the need for flood mitigation as well.
So kind of going hand in hand with the trees, we think about how trees entangle our power lines, right? And then that can be complicated to remove them, to restore power. Carlos, Could you talk about what sort of hardening methods Tampa Electric is considering after so much tree loss this year? Is undergrounding lines really the future?
Yeah, so great question. So on the trees, one of the things we encourage our residents to do, our customers, is certainly don't plant trees under the power lines, trees that can go into power lines. I know you probably driving down the street and you've seen a lot of grandfathered oaks where they look like Ys around the power lines. Well, as you heard earlier, when the ground was so saturated, even though they have a large root system, it's a shallow root system. And so a lot of those grandfather oaks were tipping over and taking out those power lines. So the first thing is obviously don't plant the trees if you can under the power lines that can grow into the power lines. What we're doing, we have a storm protection plan similar to Duke Energy and Florida Power and Light. As part of that undergrounding program, we are trying to underground about 100 miles of overhead lines underground every year. About 52% of our system's already underground. So any new development that we build has underground power lines. The problem is a lot of the older neighborhoods, nice neighborhoods, South Tampa, for example, and other areas have overhead power lines, and a lot of them are in rear lots. So one of the things we're doing as part of the storm hardening is we're identifying the laterals or the circuits that are prone to having outages because of these tree canopies, going to those homes and letting them know we have a program and we would like their approval to underground those laterals or those circuits. Again, it's only 100 miles a year, and we still have about 6,000 miles of overhead power lines. We will never underground all our power lines. There's just some areas that are not cost effective to underground, but to the extent areas are prone to outages where there's a significant tree canopy, we are looking to underground those to prevent these extended outages going forward.
What about you, Sharon, with Duke?
Yeah, very similar. You can tell we're a regulated company, a regulated industry, but we have a very similar storm protection plan. But when it comes to undergrounding, we have a little over 50% of our primary power lines are underground throughout our system. But Carlos described it very well that there are older neighborhoods where the undergrounding is ideal is a new development. And we work with those developers, as I'm sure Tampa Electric does too, up front to where it's easier to and more cost effective to underground at that time. So we'll continue that, but we also work with our cities individually when a city is doing work or when they have areas that they would like underground and they are willing to pay the additional cost. We will work with them and devise our storm protection plan around that work as well. So it really is a collaboration with the cities and or the counties. So, but very similar program to Tampa Electric's.
All right. So there's no doubt that we're seeing stronger storms. If this storm season is any indication of that, especially so late in the season, we had record high temperatures in the Gulf in November. This is sort of the new normal. Maya, I was hoping you could talk about how can we prepare for these stronger storms that clearly aren't going to let up?
I think starting by assessing your own risk and practicing and trying to be better about understanding the variety of risks that you're facing as an individual is really important, because it's not going to be the kind of thing where you can look back and say, oh, well, this has never happened before, so it probably won't happen again. You know, you have to remind people that, you know, these strong events, you can't necessarily use the past as the measure for what you see in the future. And so you can take the steps that you can do, whether that's investing in hardening your home, whether that's simply making better choices about when to evacuate. You know, as an individual, it's really about harm reduction for yourself. And so there's the individual steps that you can take. But if we want to talk about building a world around climate risk and a future where we're trying to really make it so that we are not as vulnerable to these kinds of big storms. The scope and the scale of action is so much greater than what we do as individuals. As communities, we can look at things like not just these hard engineered solutions, we can also look to how protecting wild spaces affords us protection as well. The Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council has done an economic valuation of Tampa Bay and shown that things like protecting the existing mangrove forests that we have provides more than $700 billion in flood protection benefits. You know, opting for things like living shorelines, oyster reefs, and marsh grasses and mangroves, and keeping those things in place, they're not only more affordable to install, more affordable to maintain over time, but they provide the same, if not greater, levels of flood protection for these kinds of dramatic episodic events that we're seeing. So I think it's, you know, it's yes and. We need to do all of these things. We need to think as individuals. We need to encourage our communities to use every tool in our toolbox to really protect ourselves from a world that's lashing out.
Kara, do you have anything to add from the Planning Council?
Sure. We just actually had a day-long roundtable on Monday where we had all of our member governments kind of gather in a room and think about 5 years from now and then also 20 years from now. And what I heard really resonate was the need for stronger building codes and for enforcing those stronger building codes, really taking advantage of the 50% rule, which I'm sure a lot of our residents are now painfully aware of, but making sure that we're hardening our individual homes, and then I think in a longer term scale, thinking about where there is just too much risk for individuals to live, and how we as communities can start to reduce risk by encouraging people to live in lower risk areas.
So Josh, I have another one for you. I mean, even if you're driving around Pinellas or Hillsborough County right now, there's still piles of debris on the side of many streets and many neighborhoods. We've lived with that for weeks, going on months now. It's a big job to get rid of all that debris, an expensive job. Can you talk about what you've learned from that process, what the county is maybe taking from this experience into debris removal for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk to that. So I mean, kind of repeating what a lot of people have said, but we had an unprecedented event here. But, you know, so after Hurricane Helene came through and we had all of the storm debris and from the coastal flooding and damage along those homes, we mobilized immediately with debris hauling contractors to come down and start moving that equipment, or I'm sorry, mobilizing equipment to come move that debris. I think we did a good job of getting that mobilized and started, but unfortunately we had another hurricane come within 2 weeks, and so it made it very difficult. You know, we got as much as we could before Milton came, but one of the things that I think I'm proud of is that, you know, we only took 1 day off for debris collection during Milton. The next day we were right back out there hitting it. And, you know, the county mobilized the biggest debris removal effort that we have ever done. We had 4 different debris haulers mobilizing hundreds of pieces of equipment out on the road. I mean, in the weeks following the storm, I couldn't drive down the street without seeing multiple of those giant, you know, double black FEMA trucks out there picking up debris. You know, we were able to pick up, you know, so we go back and compare to Hurricane Irma a lot because that was the most recent event. So, you know, we were able to collect and exceed the amount collected after Hurricane Irma, which took about 6 months. We were able to collect that this year within 2 weeks. So it's the volume just so far exceeded anything that had happened before. So we're talking about 5 million plus cubic yards of debris, which could fill up Tropicana Field 1.5 times over. So I think, you know, a lot of progress has been made, and so while piles are still out there, you know, we have collected over 3.4 million cubic yards from the community. And so just to give a kind of a sense of scale of, well, how much is that? So picture a full dump truck and then line those up end to end, and it would stretch from here all the way to Savannah, Georgia. So, Now, that's not saying that, it's perfect, because I get it, and there's lots of debris piles that are out there, but I really do want to shout out our staff and our contractors that have worked with us to really help the community recover much faster than it could have taken. And so I think we have made a lot of progress, and I think we can take away that. One thing that I think we could take away as a lesson learned that we could try to do even better with is providing for additional debris sites for community collection. We do have a lot of those sites. We opened up additional sites. We extended the hours. We have 24-hour sites. We even opened up pop-up sites around the community. But, the more of those that we're able to open to help lessen the drive time between sites or between pickup and those sites can just help the process go more efficiently. So I am happy to say, and hopefully you all have heard about this, that our final pass for debris collection is going to begin on Monday. So we are getting close. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and we're really trying to work. That we had an aggressive target given to us, which was to complete all of it within 90 days. And so we're working tirelessly every day to try to stay on track to meeting that goal.
Okay. So Maya, another concern, mostly for the coastal communities and obviously our Gulf, is red tide. It seems to be something that pops up, stirred up from hurricanes. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the risks and what we need to understand and to better protect our Gulf, I guess, after hurricanes?
Yeah, so you need several kinds of key ingredients for a red tide bloom to really take off. And so some of those things are driven by ocean circulation patterns. You get deep upwelling that takes these organisms that are naturally occurring in the Gulf of Mexico and move them to nearshore coastal environments. But you also have things like winds and tides that are moving all of these kind of living things around. And hurricanes are really influencing, the winds and the currents and what's getting sort of put into the vicinity of our nearshore coastal areas. When you combine that with a rainfall event like hurricanes tend to be, what happens is that all of that stormwater runoff, if we have wastewater treatment plants that have sanitary sewer overflows, all of that extra fresh water and has a lot of pollution in it, and that nutrient pollution or nitrogen that's in there acts as food for the algae species that is responsible for red tide. So if you have conditions where currents and winds have pushed a naturally occurring organism up to the coast, and then you basically give it a bunch of food, that's when you get these extreme algae blooms that are occurring. And it's really hard because I had a lot of phone calls after Helene where people were sort of like asking, what about red tide? What about red tide? And I'm like, the community does not need to be chasing another disaster. We have plenty to deal with. It's offshore. It's not really like interacting. But you have to be aware that it could move onshore, it could move closer. And it's when you're in one of those communities where everybody's flooded out, they're not able to get their power restored because it's not safe yet. So everybody's out there, open windows, exposed, breathing that air. So when you do get those bloom conditions, which unfortunately did start to happen, you have, all of the trauma of a hurricane, plus now the actual health risks and from respiratory risks associated with a red tide. So there's to some extent parts of it that you can't control. That's kind of why we say that really one of your best courses of action is to make sure that you're protecting water quality and doing everything that you can for water quality on all of the blue sky days, because everything you do to make sure that you have clean water on all of the good days is building in adaptive capacity where the natural system is able to take that pollution and assimilate it and not sort of lead it to this like tipping point where we've got these horrible algae blooms or really bad conditions. So sometimes it's doing the best you can from day to day and hope that that builds in sort of enough space to deal with disasters as they might come.
All right. Well, before we get to this large stack of questions from you all, I have one last question for Carlos and Sharon. We talked a little bit about the lessons you've learned from Duke and Tampa Electric's perspective from this hurricane season, but I'm wondering, can we talk a little bit further about how you're taking those lessons and applying them for future storms, not just for next year, but for the next 5 years or 10 years, when we're looking at storms and not really knowing just how strong they may be?
Sure. So obviously, like I said earlier, every storm provides new lessons learned. You know, one of the things that Tampa Electric has done is we've really changed the way our system is set up over the last 10 years. Um, our fleet is significantly much more efficient, about 33% more efficient than it was even 10 years ago. And what I mean by that is the heat rate, which is how efficient these units are, is significantly dropped. So think of a car. If your car was getting 20 miles per gallon and you make some changes to the engine, and now you get 30 miles per gallon. That's essentially what we've done with our fleet. We've also reduced the amount of coal burn in our units. 10 years ago, about 60% of our generation from Tampa Electric was generated by coal. This year is going to be less than 1%. So significant reduction, and that translates to about a 47% reduction in CO2 emissions. So even though that's more of a macro issue that we're doing, we're trying to minimize the impact that our generation has on climate change. The other thing that we're doing is kind of taking the lessons learned from what we're seeing from other entities. We saw that Tampa General was using this aquafence concept. Very successful, protected their facilities extremely well. We're trying to see if we can use an aquafence around some of our substations, lower lying substations. You know, storm hardening has been a very beneficial program for us from a resilience standpoint. Even during blue sky events, we've seen our reliability improve 30% just in the past 4 years. Storm protection plan was really implemented for gray sky events, but we're seeing the benefits by doing a lot of the vegetation management and undergrounding. We're seeing that reliability improvements, reduced momentary outages, reduced duration of the outages. So we're going to continue investing to try to improve that resilience, which translates to better reliability for customers.
Yeah, sure, and I'll piggyback on some of that. So our storm protection program, not unlike what Carlos describes, includes components like self-healing technology. And think of that as like your navigation system that as you're driving down the road may tell you, oh, take this route because there's a crash up ahead. Well, the self-healing technology is similar to that in that it senses a fault and will direct the power to another feeder that does not have a fault on it. So it, very basically, as I'm not an engineer, you can think of it that way. And so that's part of our storm protection plan, and we have saved, with Helene and Milton, we saved over 300,000 outages as a result of installing that equipment. Same thing with our poles. That's another part of our storm protection plan, is changing out poles from our wood poles to a concrete or steel pole. Over the last couple of years, we've changed out over 40,000 poles, and this year we intend to change out 15,000. So all of those things are working towards hardening our grid and making our assets more resilient, which will translate into better outcome for our customers during these major weather events. And I would say another thing too, when we speak about our generation, one of the things in Crystal River, so we too use some of the aqueduct fencing and the tiger dams is what we call them, and that doesn't always have an application in a place like Crystal River, perhaps, where it's right on the coast, and the storm surge was in some cases 12 to 15 feet there. But what we did years ago when we built one of our substations in that area was we built that substation up higher, like 10 to 12 feet. That really made an impact with this storm. So taking those kinds of learnings as to how we build our infrastructure for regular blue sky days has made an impact in how we associate things for these major events as well.
Okay. We're going to get to some of our audience questions. And this first one is something we've heard about from many residents at the Times as an editor. I've read emails that have asked this very question multiple times, and it kind of plays into what you just said, Sharon, about raising your substations, but looking at it from a residential side. So maybe Josh, you can take this one. With our growing population in Hillsborough County, building more and more homes requiring higher elevations on new homes, what does that mean for older subdivisions that are now seeing that flooding from new subdivisions that are elevated and causing that inland flooding? Are there solutions for those subdivisions?
Yeah, I think, that's going to be one of those things that we're really going to have to look at on the regulatory side, and that the commission is going to have to consider when we discuss things like that coming out of the study. So, so the county started participating in the National Flood Insurance Program in 1980. So along with that came, the requirement to have some floodplain regulations, base flood elevation, and things like that. So, that has improved, I think, the resiliency of some of these, the newer communities, but recognizing that we have a lot of homes that were built pre-regulation and were allowed to build in floodplain areas without having to meet those floodplain requirements. So when new developments get built, they get built to a standard of, holding and maintaining the pre-conditions up to a 25-year event. So, the challenge that, we had with a storm like Helene and with Milton is that they far exceeded that level of event. So I think, a lot of those areas probably would have received or would have had that flooding anyway, regardless. But, we recognize that there is that perception of, okay, this community over here is built up higher and we're lower, and so they're causing the flooding on us. Really, it's, they're designed not to do that, but when you have an event that far exceeds what any of the design criteria is, that's when you get the widespread flooding like we did now, so.
So Sharon, this question might be a good one for you. Are microgrids being considered to increase the resilience in areas, especially stormwater pumps? It's the best I can do with the handwriting, sorry. So microgrids, is that something that you're considering?
Yeah, thank you, Justine. Yeah, we actually are utilizing microgrids. We have one that is being built at Johns Hopkins in St. Pete, and eventually it will be used for to serve that the school operates as a shelter for special needs children during events, and so it will be used to power that. We're also looking at them in other capacities as pilot programs to test the infrastructure and those types of assets, but yet we're working on one potential one with UCF in partnership with them. So there are things that we are definitely utilizing them for and looking at them for future use as well.
Okay, this next one is for you, Carlos. With the recent TECO rate case approval, how does the company plan to upgrade the electrical grid to provide greater resiliency, not to have as many power outages as experienced during Hurricane Milton?
So, great question. So yes, yesterday the Florida Public Service Commission approved Tampa Electric's retail rate case. One of the components within the retail rate case was what we referred to as ADI or GRR, which is the grid reliability. And that includes about 40 different programs to improve the resilience of our transmission and distribution system. Sharon touched on it earlier, adding reclosers, adding different equipment to try to compartmentalize outages. So when you do have an outage on one of our circuits, and keep in mind we have about 800 different circuits on our system, excuse me. So a lot of times customers were frustrated because they had an outage at their home, but yet their neighbor across the street didn't have an outage. It's likely because the neighbor across the street was on a different circuit. So some of the infrastructure improvements that we're doing as part of this GRR mechanism is trying to compartmentalize those outages so we can switch these circuits and try to bring back as many customers at once without having to de-energize the entire circuit. So that's part of the request that we had in the retail rate case, that and continuing our storm protection plan to, again, try to reduce the amount of outages, improve the reliability, and get those outages, when we do have outages, get that restoration time down.
Okay. This one I think is a good one for you, Maya. What are the top 3 things local and state government can do to protect water quality in Tampa Bay?
For every flood control project that you invest in, make sure that it has significant water quality components as well. That water needs to move slower, not faster. And I know that's hard to hear, but the downstream impacts are significant. We also have been, this area has been both a national and international leader in terms of wastewater treatment. We have the country's largest advanced wastewater treatment plant in the city of Tampa. We had the first advanced wastewater treatment plant in the city of Palmetto, and the country's largest reclaimed water system in the city of St. Petersburg. But that was all in the 1970s and 1980s. And y'all, it is almost 2025, and we want to continue to be leaders on wastewater treatment, and that means investing in 21st century technology for treating our wastewater. Even though we do a pretty darn good job of making sure that water is clean, there are still chemicals, pharmaceuticals, PFAS, and nutrients, the basic kinds of pollution that we know drives things like algae blooms. So continuing to invest in our wastewater infrastructure is really critical if we want this place to continue to be a lovely place to live. And then I think we need to protect as much as we can of the wild Florida that's left. That's really critical, not just for fish and wildlife, but for us, for our peace of mind, for the things that we find comfort in, the places we go for mental health. And it also helps provide all of these same kinds of benefits for helping give space for water to move more slowly on the land so that we're not just shunting it and moving it through these really overdeveloped areas and putting it out to the bay and the Gulf as quickly as possible.
Kara, this next one's for you. What projects do Tampa Bay regulators and planning have in mind to help areas outside of our metro core, so outside of downtown Tampa or St. Pete, become more resilient?
So a lot of those areas can kind of learn from our mistakes in the metro core, and Citrus County is one of our member governments, and they're really interested in doing that type of action. But a lot of what they can do is like what Maya just referred to, is preserving what's naturally, in existence there, making sure that water is not obstructed by new development, kind of sticking to the development regulations that they already have in place, and not allowing for additional development in areas that are serving for water quality, serve as water quality purposes. And I think those are some of the bigger lessons to learn. And then we have some opportunities as well as challenges as our neighborhoods in this urban core are flooding, and there's development pressure to develop in the higher ground areas, to make sure that we do a better job of that this time, not adding fill or adding infrastructure where there doesn't need to be infrastructure, and then trying to balance that with affordability for our residents who might be moving from affordable neighborhoods that happen to flood to higher areas like inland Pinellas County, Pinellas Park areas, making sure that we kind of try to maintain that affordability and think about issues like climate gentrification.
Okay. So Sharon, this next one's for you. Can you talk about any sort of support or benefit that solar panels or batteries play in Duke's plan for resiliency?
Yes, certainly. As part of our climate resiliency program in general, solar plants play a major part in that, and we have almost 1,500 megawatts of solar installed today, and we'll plan to build a like amount in the next 5 years as well. And that just gives us a good balance in our mix of fuel and generation. Carlos touched on that earlier, getting away from coal, and our coal plants will be retired very shortly, and then we will be natural gas and solar. But solar is a big part of our climate resiliency program, and I will say that through the storms, and these were some major storms we've had over the last several years, we've had some very good operations from our solar plants and the panels in general, but they are a big part of our climate resiliency plan.
Okay. So back to you, Maya. What do you wish residents understood about the risk when living in coastal Tampa Bay?
So I grew up right on one house from the water, I would say Joseph Sound and Crystal Beach, and I understand every single reason why people would want to live in these places that are inherently incredibly risky to live, because for every 364 days of excellent sunsets, beautiful views, fun times, you might get one day out of the year where your life looks like something different. And so if that calculus is inherently personal, and if it's worth it to you, I understand it. But I wish that you understood that it also has an economic consequence for everyone else in the region, for every person that ends up making the choice to live in a place that's inherently risky. The burden, the economic burden of that risk is borne by us all. It's in the insurance rates we pay, it's in the mortgage rates we pay, and all of these things play out over time. So our individual decisions have collective consequences, and I wish people understood that.
So this is sort of a follow-up to that, but anyone is welcome to chime in here. Do you think flood zone designations will be really evaluated for flood insurance? And if so, how soon? Anyone want to make a bet? Go ahead, Kara.
Sure. I think some of our counties are actively doing that. I think Pinellas County is currently doing that. I could see, other counties continuing to follow suit. I would also kind of like to think about the flood data. The flood risk that FEMA shows is past risk, and our residents need to start looking at future risk and thinking about, maybe the insurance company doesn't say there's a high risk here yet, but they're looking at hindcasting. So I need to start thinking about what happens when sea level rise starts combining with rainier days and stronger storms.
Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just say that, at Hillsborough County, we're actively doing that on a regular basis, updating our stormwater modeling, looking at our watershed master plans, and as we do that, we work to update those maps and those flood risk maps, and we work with FEMA to update their maps as well. So, that's one of the things that we do as participation in the National Flood Insurance Program that I mentioned. So one of the benefits to the community that provides is because of our rating, our community rating through that program, the residents of Hillsborough County pay lower premiums for flood insurance. So because of the score that we're able to achieve with the participation that we do, residents get a 25% discount on their flood insurance, whether they live in a flood zone or not.
Flood insurance is part of it, but it's also property insurance, and they are absolutely thinking about pricing future risk right now. And if you want to know what's driving some of the mobility and migration patterns in our region, it's the affordability or lack thereof for insurance, and none of us have gotten our insurance bills for next year yet. These things are going to continue to happen, and so the first people that are getting pushed out of their homes might not even be the people that flooded, but they're the people that are getting hit with a $15,000, $20,000 insurance bill, and that's just too much for them to absorb in addition to their mortgage, their property tax, and everything else.
All right, here's another one that anyone who would like to chime in, you're more than welcome to. In the next 25 years, I've read that Tampa Bay will be 3 feet underwater. That means our homes will be worthless. With rising sea levels and climate change, what needs to happen now to prepare for that? Who wants to take that?
I can start. I don't think that's the right
Okay.
target, but and Maya has helped us set or to kind of look at the range of targets that we need to think about. So we have a few curves of sea level rise that we look at to say we need to plan within these curves. But a lot of what we need to think about, or I think has already been said on the stage, is we need to look at higher building standards for high-risk areas, think about preserving our conservation areas that are helping with those water quality treatment impacts, and then thinking about what areas are too high risk to continue to develop in, and where we can potentially relocate people within our region if they want to stay in the region to build more density in safer areas.
So I think we're looking at 3 feet closer to 80 years from now. Don't put money down on it, but I think it's a longer time scale than the next 20 years. And that's not the worst case scenario, but 3 feet would be really bad for our area. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And we have to start having these really hard conversations about what to do, because we can't invest in protecting every single vulnerable property in the region. We just can't. There's not enough resources to do it. There are some areas that we can protect. There are some that we might have to abandon. And we need to do right by people if we do that, because your property is the most important wealth creation device that you have. And we owe it to each other as a community to provide outlets and measured ways where we can take those investments and allow them to get reinvested somewhere else to keep people, if not whole, pretty darn close to whole, but in a way that they're not ruined every couple of months, which is what's happening to some people right now. And that's hard, and I'm really glad y'all are here today, because we can start to get past the question of is it happening or isn't it happening, but we can start to talk about what is it that's acceptable to us as a community. And, Carlos and I might agree on some things, we might disagree on other things, but we're both reasonable people, and that's okay. But that's how we forge the path forward. Some of it gets protected, some of it doesn't. We accept it, we work together, that's the path.
I guess the one thing I would add is, we've spoken with our customers and we've participated in JD Power results, and we know the two things that are most important to our customers are price and reliability. So obviously that's a focus when we go in for rates, or we want to do a certain program. We're focused on trying to keep things as affordable as possible. At the same time, we are concerned about rising seawater. We're trying to move away from carbon to the extent we can, but it's a pricey proposition. Solar is not the panacea for us. We live in a very small footprint, Tampa Electric service area, so we can't go 100% solar and batteries. It would be too costly. So we have to look at other options to try to minimize the amount of carbon footprint we had. So we're looking at that. We have a resource planning group. Luckily, the Inflation Reduction Act provided a 30% tax credit. That has made solar much more economic. But again, even though we've added a tremendous amount of solar in our system, about 1,500 megawatts, it still represents about 11% of our generation mix overall. So it's not going to be the answer for us long term. We have to look at other solutions to make our power plants more efficient, to do things that are going to minimize our carbon footprint, but it's not exclusively going to be solar.
I just wanted to add on to that. If you haven't seen or heard of the Upper Limit Project, it's a way of communicating about how much sea level rise we can reasonably live with. And it says that we're baked in for about 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100, but we really need to think about, instead of just trying to dump the buckets of water back into the ocean, turning off that faucet, so really reducing our greenhouse gas emissions today and drastically going forward.
So this last question I think everyone can answer. We'll just go on down the line. It's a nice way to cap this great conversation, and I thank you all for being here. So this card says, if we knew we were going to have these 2 storms again next year, what would you be doing differently now in terms of planning for that storm? Or storms, plural. Who wants to go first?
I would say, one of the things that we would like to do better, and this is like kind of a lesson learned, is be able to provide more of an advanced warning, especially to folks that are most vulnerable in the inland areas that might not have that level of awareness or consciousness of the risk that they might face with a storm like this. So we're really good at notifying and evacuating coastal areas in advance of storm surge. But we, I think, could make some headway in getting better at notifying residents of the risk that they might face of inland flooding in an event like this.
I don't have an emergency response kind of thing, but I would just clone myself or try and teach as many people as I can how to have conversations about thinking through what choices you're going to make for your risk reduction, how you're going to evacuate, what you need to do in advance, so that people have like sounding boards and reality checks on whether or not what they're thinking, if that makes sense, if that seems like the right thing forward, because I kind of think that's where it starts.
Yeah, I think a year would be too short term to make a lot of the changes that we're kind of looking at the Regional Planning Council, but definitely thinking about, again, like Maya was saying, helping people to understand their risk. It's not just the storm surge that you're seeing mapped on the news. It could also be rain, and as we saw, there are rivers that are going to rise potentially 2 weeks after the storm. So we need to help people to understand how to think about those kind of, they're not new, but they're things that we didn't think about in previous storms, the flood types that we saw in these past 2 storms.
So as native Floridians, you know, we kind of sometimes get a little complacent, a lot of us do, in preparing for storms and thinking, oh, it's going to go away or it won't hit us. But I think that is changing. In the past 5 years, I think we've had 14 major storms in the state of Florida. So that's what we are dealing with. As a company who puts, during a storm, we put employees in our emergency operating centers. They sit there with the county, and they are that lifeline back to our company from the county's perspective. In hearing some of the stories that those employees came back to tell of the people who did not evacuate and seeing the damage afterwards, I would say, please, everybody needs to take those evacuation notices very, very seriously. As we all know, everyone, and there are probably some in this room who have major damage in their homes and maybe some that are uninhabitable. I know we all have employees who cannot live in their homes. So that would be the one thing I would say from a personal standpoint. As a company, as we've all said, there's a lot of, this was unprecedented storm surge in this area and in this community. And one of the things that we are taking back as a company is, and I know we've all heard the situations where there are still some homes that cannot receive power because there is customer-owned equipment damage. And there are still a lot of people who have to fix their, homes. And so as a utility, we're partnering with those counties to ensure that the inspections get done on the home before they can get in. And so really fine-tuning that process to make it faster, to make it more efficient for the customers and the end use is one of the things we're going to really be focused on, and how we can improve that, working with our counties and partnering with them.
Yeah, so great points. Obviously, heating evacuation warnings is critical, and if you are evacuating, turn your main breaker off. If you're in a flood area, you can seriously damage your home if you have flooding and your breaker's still on. I know people don't like doing that because they don't want to come back, and obviously everything in the fridge is spoiled, but empty out the fridge, turn the breaker off. That certainly could protect a lot of customers. We're obviously going to continue with our storm protection plan and doing the investments that we believe are helping us restore power faster, make the system more resilient. Hopefully we don't have a storm or another year like this, unprecedented year. It's supposed to be once in 100 years where we had a storm like this. But if we do, we're going to be prepared. We were able to logistically, like I said, bring in 6,000 resources to help with the storm, and we would likely do that again. We model, just like Duke and FPL, we model what the impacts of these types of storms are going to be, and prior to Milton, we expected to have about that many outages. Unfortunately, that's the reality of a storm, and that brings those types of winds with the wind field that was north of the storm that really impacted Pinellas and Hillsborough County significantly with numerous tornadoes. Again, hopefully we don't see something like that, but we're going to be prepared if something like that happens in the future.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us and being part of this conversation, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. It's been a great discussion. For everyone who registered for this event tonight, you will receive a link and an email that will share a recording of this event. We want to say thank you also to Tampa Electric for sponsoring this event. This is the first of a 2-part Sustainability Spotlight Tampa Bay series, so please stay tuned for more information about part 2, which will come early next year. Thank you again for joining us.